In today's video, I'm going to be going over some of the most popular decks in today's metagame and how to beat them. Whether you choose to play hand traps or not in your deck, I'm going to be covering the key cards to hit in each deck with your interruptions, so you can get value out of this regardless of whether you choose to play hand traps or not. I'll also be mostly covering decks that are prevalent in both the TCG and in Master Duel, so regardless of which game you play, you can hopefully get something valuable out of this. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into the video. So the way I have this set up is for each deck I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be putting what I feel are the 3 most important cards for you to hit against this deck, whether it be with your hand traps or with your other disruptions, just so whether you're playing a deck that plays hand traps or doesn't, you can still get value out of this video because you'll know the key cards and what they do for each of these meta decks. And then following this up, I'm going to be also covering 4 of the most popular lingering hand traps, being Dimension Shifter, Droll, and both the Mulcharmies, just so you have a better idea of whether it's worth playing those lingering effects against these decks. Without any further ado, starting off with the very first deck, it's going to be Snake Eyes Azamina, arguably the best deck of the format. I would say one of the biggest things to hit in this deck is definitely the Diabellstar engine, especially Black Witch. Black Witch is very good in this deck, not only because it gets them access to starters, but it also makes it so the deck very quickly snowballs advantage with a card like Deception. Deception not only gets them access to one of their starter cards in Original Sinful Spoils, it also sets up an Omni-Negate afterwards, which is very powerful. And all of this is just off of Black Witch and a discard. So if you see something like Diabellstar the Black Witch, or if you see something like the Wanted poster, I'd say definitely go ahead and stop that. It's probably the biggest thing you want to stop in this deck, just because of how quickly the advantage snowballs if you let it go through. And Deception and Sinful Spoils is also a pretty good card to stop if you have something like Ogre in particular, or something that removes a face-up spell or trap like Cosmic Cyclone. So if they play that first, it's also very important to stop, because if this card resolves, it means you're not going to be able to hold your interruptions for much longer, since they'll be able to put out an Omni-Negate onto the board. Next up is Snake Eyes Flamberge Dragon, and I guess just the Snake Eyes engine in general. Of course, it is a pretty integral part of the deck, but I think Flamberge is one of the more important parts of this deck. Not only does it help them play around a card like Nibiru, it also gives them more extension and more follow-up, so definitely cutting off access to Flamberge is something you want to be doing with your interruptions, making it so their Snake Eyes cards can't get access to this and bring more bodies back, plus threaten to push something to your spell and trap zone. And finally, Bonfire, I think in particular, is worth talking about. If your opponent starts with Bonfire, you pretty much always want to stop it, and the reason being, there's no reason for them to start with Bonfire, since it loses super hard to Droll, unless they had to. So if they start with Bonfire, most likely their hand is one where they need the Bonfire to go through in order to start their plays. Otherwise, they would have just led with something else to better play around a card like Droll and Lockbird. And then for this section, I wanted to go over the 4 lingering effects. So whether you play these hand traps or not, there are some other side deck cards like Different Dimension Ground, Mistaken Arrest, things like that would do similar things to this. So once again, if you don't play these cards in your deck, you can still get value out of this section, since I'm going to be going over how strong these linger effects are against each deck. And of course, just to preface, there isn't really a specific timing you have to nail down when using these cards for the most part. So for the most part, I'm just going to be talking about why these are either good, mid, or bad against these decks. So against the Snake Eyes Azamina deck, I would say that Dimension Shifter is, of course, very good. They need their graveyard in order to get things set up and start popping off. Droll and Lockbird, they have quite a few search cards as well. Things like the Wanted poster, Bonfire, the Snake Eyes engine, they all end up searching through their deck quite a bit, and using this early can cut them off from getting too much advantage on you. And both the Mulcharmies are very solid against this deck as well. While it does have ways around it and can make some solid half boards, I think that seeing these cards against the deck can be very powerful and easily draw you 2 to 3 cards, even if they don't go throughout their full combo. And plus, the upside of these cards against a crazy combo deck like this is it does usually prevent them from getting out their full end board, and it makes it so whatever half board they put up is definitely more breakable and gives you more of a chance. The next deck I'm going to be talking about is Yubel. The key card in the Yubel engine is Samsara D Lotus and Spirit of Yubel. Samsara D Lotus summoning Spirit of Yubel from deck and Spirit of Yubel getting Nightmare Pain is pretty much how they start off their best combos in the deck. And I think being able to stop Samsara D Lotus in particular is very good, because you're removing the body from the field since it needs to tribute for cost. So if you have something like Ash Blossom, I would say definitely use it on Samsara D Lotus. Or if you have something like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, you can save it for the Spirit of Yubel, since if you use it on Samsara D Lotus, they can bring it back later on in the combo and just use this effect again. Whereas if you stop the Spirit of Yubel, they won't be able to get access to the Nightmare Pain in the combo unless they have hard drawn it already. Something else important in the deck is the Fiendsmith engine. In particular, the Fiendsmith engine in the Yubel deck is very good because it gives them access to Aerial Eater. Aerial Eater will get them to their Yubel engine if they only start with, let's say, random extenders, for example, like Dark Beckoning Beast. So being able to cut off the Fiendsmith engine means you cut them not only off of a card like Desiree potentially, or DDD Wave Hiking Caesar, you also prevent them from getting access to their Yubel engine, and their end board is just going to be a lot more manageable without those cards. And then finally, Dark Beckoning Beast I think is a pretty solid card to hit. Hitting it makes it so they don't get the additional normal summon and they don't get opening. Opening would give them another body plus extension from the graveyard, which is very strong. So I think that being able to cut off Beckoning Beast right away will cut off that stream of bodies and make it so your opponent has to have hard drawn a few extenders in order to play through it. And then against Yubel, the 4 lingering hand traps are all very good against it. I would say this is even better than against the Snake Eyes Azamina deck, or the Mulcharmies at least, because Yubel doesn't really have a good way to make too many half wards aside from just a card like Phantom Pass. Whereas against Snake Eyes, they have more layered things even under the Mulcharmy cards with like IP, Temple, things of that nature. So if you have any of these types of cards against Yubel, these are all very strong cards you should consider playing in your deck, because I think seeing any of these against the Yubel deck will give you a lot better of a shot winning when going second. Next up is Tenpai, and against Tenpai, the main thing you're hitting is their engine, of course. I would say Pydra is the one you want to go after, because Pydra not only gets them access to Kaiman, which can play around a card like Droll and Lockbird, it can be used during the battle phase to play around a card like Valor, but if you let Pydra resolve, you risk them getting access to Sangha Summoning, which can then make it so the rest of your hand traps in that turn are not going to be useful at all. So I think that hitting the Pydra right away is a very solid play, so you should definitely be using your cards like Infinite Impermanence and things on Pydra. Alternatively, if your opponent starts with just Tenpai Dragon Chandra, that's also a very important card to hit, because you can't use something like Ash Blossom against it if they just start with Chandra. So hitting it with Infinite Impermanence or removing it from the field with something like IP into SP is very strong against the deck, and makes it so it's harder for them to extend without hard drawing a card like the Sangha Kaiman or Sangha Summoning, since Chandra requires you to have another Fire Dragon on the board. So if your opponent just normal summons Chandra, if you can somehow remove it right away from the field, you'd be in a pretty solid place, because now you know your opponent can really only extend if they have one of the spell cards. I would say Hieratic Seals is something you want to save your hand traps for, especially if you're playing a deck that loses to Quakimeru Drago. Most Tenpai players will be siding in Quakimeru Drago when they choose to go first and just end on Hieratic Seals. That's why I think it's important to save cards like Ash Blossom against Tenpai when they go first specifically, because you prevent the Seals from summoning that Dragon from deck, which is key for them to get follow-up, or key for them to get access to a card like Drago and put up a floodgate on their side of the field. Tenpai Dragon is one of those decks that's pretty resilient to these lingering hand traps, so I would say that all of Shifter, Droll, and both the Mulcharmies won't really do anything against this deck, and I would not recommend playing them against them. Droll and Lockbird is pretty easily countered because Pydra can 1 set the field spell, but 2, even if Pydra adds a card like Kaiman, they can simply chain it to your Droll and Lockbird and it won't have done anything. I think the only time Droll and Lockbird is even usable is if they specifically open with a card like Terraforming, or if they open with a card like Pot of Prosperity. So for that reason, it's definitely not worth it. Shifter is a card they play themselves, they can OTK under it pretty simply, and if you hit them with any of the Mulcharmies, even if they give you a couple of draws, they're just going to OTK you that turn, so it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And then the next deck I want to talk about is Fire King Azamina, so specifically the deck with the Fire King engine and not just the Snake Eyes cards. Against this deck, I would say one of their key cards to hit is the Fire King Island and Fire King Sanctuary. Being able to hit Fire King Island makes it so you cut them off of that large stream of cards that they have when they destroy a fire successfully. They're going to have to go more out of their way to try to destroy fire monsters and trigger effects like Secret Fire King Garunix in their hand. Not to mention, going after Fire King Island in particular is also good, because it essentially will just nuke your opponent's board for you if you remove it from the field with a card like Cosmic Cyclone, for example, making it so that targeting it down when you go second will definitely force your opponent to either use up some of their interruptions or force them to make some plays so that they don't lose as hard to their own Fire King Island. Sanctuary, I wanted to point out, is also important in this deck because they have access to the rank 8 Fire King in their extra deck, which can nuke all monsters on the field when they XD summon it using Fire King Sanctuary. So do keep that in mind when you play against this deck. Targeting down the Fire King Sanctuary can also be important, just because as soon as they destroy fire, they can get 2 level 8s on the board and then XD summon into that, and you'll be in a lot of trouble if you don't see it coming. Against this deck in particular, I highlighted Original Sinful Spoil Snake Eyes because this is a card that sort of bridges the engines together. They'll play a card like Diabellstar to get access to this card, and then this can either get them access to their Fire King engine if they don't have any through Legendary Fire King Ponix, or they can get access to a small Snake Eyes package they play to put up some more bodies on the board and get some more link fodder if they already have access to their Fire King engine. Cutting off access to this card is very important because that means it's a lot harder for them to bridge their engines together, because if they start with the Snake Eyes stuff, they go to Poplar grabs this, but then if they don't see any of the cards like Fire King Island or Ponix, they're not going to be able to get access to this Fire King side of their deck, because once they get access to the Fire King cards and start putting some layered disruption into the graveyard, I think you're going to have a lot harder of a time than if they just play with the few Snake Eyes cards that they have. And then finally, the key cards against this deck are of course the Fire King monsters themselves. I think Sacred Fire King Runick in particular is important, because this is how they start snowballing after a single card has been destroyed. They'll summon this from hand or grave, destroy another guy, that guy will trigger, bringing something back, and they sort of just snowball out of control from there. So I think that being able to hit this card, or playing in a way that doesn't trigger this card, will be very important against this deck to make sure they don't start snowballing that advantage on both turns. Of course, Legendary Fire King Ponix, like I mentioned, is one of the key starters for this deck as well, letting them get access to their Fire King Island, so being able to cut them off of this as well is also very important. One thing to note is if you do have a card like Effect Veiler or Infinite Impermanence, your opponent may be able to use a card like Fire King High After Kieran to play around it by simply popping their monster once you target it, so do keep that in mind if you have those types of disruptions. Against the Fire King Azamina deck, I would say most of the lingering hand traps are very good. Shifter's great, they can't really do much under it because all their guys benefit from being in the graveyard, the Fire King monsters especially. Droll and Lockbird's also pretty solid because they have quite a few searching effects, and regardless of whether they start with the Snake Eyes engine or the Fire King engine, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for them to bridge the other part of their deck under a card like Droll and Lockbird, making it so it's pretty worth it in my opinion. I think Motarmi Perulia is also very good because a lot of the Fire Kings like Kieran and Garunix will summon from the hand, plus they'll have effects like Diabell Star, Snake Eyes, Poplar, and of course their normal summon. Meaning if you drop this on them, they're going to have to go out of their way to not play a lot of those powerful extenders in their hand, and making it so their board is a lot more manageable for you to deal with. The reason I put Fuwalos as sort of mid in this matchup is because I think the Fire King cards in particular give this deck a lot better of a time into Fuwalos because they can make better half boards. The Fire King monsters make it so if you end on a board that doesn't really look like much, so if you have something like Arvada plus like a princess, it actually can turn into a lot once they trigger a single interruption like Arvada, because then they'll destroy a card and then their Fire King monsters will trigger and they can start storming the field from there on your turn. And plus if they have something like Sanctuary on top, that's even better for them because they can start XC summoning on your turn. So while this card isn't terrible into them, and I think it still could be worth playing, I don't think you can rely on this card fully stopping your opponent from setting anything up at all like it would against a deck like Yubel, for example. Next up is Centur-ion, and against Centur-ion, I would say the main cards to hit are their normal summon starters, being Primera and Trudea. If you're able to stop these cards, they're going to have to see specific extenders in their hand to push through these plays, and Centur-ion as a deck doesn't have that many extenders to begin with, so being able to hit one of their one-card starters makes it so it's going to be more likely that your opponent's simply just going to pass turn from there. Something in particular about Primera that's also good is by removing it off the field, you take away one of their most easily accessible tuners, and it'll make it a lot harder for them to make synchro plays because they'll only realistically have one more tuner left in their deck that they kind of have to go out of their way in order to get. The next card is Stand Up Centur-ion. This is the main way they interrupt you on your turn, because during their turn one, sometimes they'll set up an interruption, sometimes they won't, and they'll just play for interrupting you on your turn. So if you have a way to remove Stand Up Centur-ion before it triggers its effect to synchro summon, I think that could be huge because it essentially prevents all their Centur-ion monsters from getting any real value on your turn because they'll be stuck on the field not really doing anything. And then finally, the card I want to talk about is Crimson Dragon. So Crimson Dragon in this deck allows them to summon things like Cosmic Blazar, which is essentially just the best Omni Negate in the game at the moment. If you're able to interrupt this with a card like Forbidden Droplets, Forbidden Chalice, or something like Ghost Ogre, because it does have to successfully return itself to the extra deck, I think that targeting this down, if you had no way to stop them on their first turn, is also really important. And just knowing that this is sort of the choke point for how they interact you on your turn, and if you're able to stop this, then they essentially won't have any way to further disrupt on your turn with their engine. Against the Centur-ion deck, I would say all of these are pretty bad. I put Droll and Lockbird as maybe mid because there is maybe a chance against the deck that it will stop one or two searches, because as far as I know, their regular combo will search at least 2 times. But that being said, it's not like Centur-ion can't play with just a single search. So I would say for the most part, you shouldn't really be playing any of these cards against the Centur-ion deck. If you have nothing else to side out against this deck and you have to keep this in, it's not the worst card in the world, because there are going to be hands where you can prevent them from getting a lot more value with the Bystials, or with preventing them from getting additional searches for additional engine pieces. And then the next deck I want to talk about is Branded. So Branded, of course, everyone knows the main card to hit is Branded Fusion, but I also put Branded in High Spirits in the corner because this card is also very strong in this deck. It almost acts as a second copy of Branded Fusion just because of how much advantage it generates. If your opponent has just like a Branded in High Spirits, for example, and you know they really can't get access to Branded Fusion, I'd say it's definitely worth stopping the Branded in High Spirits, because you let it resolve and you stop the Branded Fusion later on in the turn. I still feel like they generate enough advantage to be at a point where they're okay with that. So I think that cutting them off of Branded in High Spirits to begin with is also a pretty solid choice, and definitely one that I wouldn't sleep on. And then the next cards I want to talk about are Albion and Lubellion specifically, so the ones that allow them to fusion summon additional monsters out onto the field. I think that hitting Albion is important because of course it's going to cut them off of a card like Mirror Jade, but also I wanted to bring attention to the graveyard effects of these monsters, because this is what makes Branded one of the most scariest decks. Is even if it seems like they don't have much word presence, in the end phase all their effects will trigger and they'll get more advantage to their field and more advantage back to their hand, making it so they have more plays on your turn. So I think that hitting these cards out of the graveyard with cards like DD Crow, Call by the Grave are very strong. And then finally the last card I put is Albion, because if it gets to your turn, you didn't have any hand traps to stop your opponent, I would say preventing Albion from resolving is very strong with a card like Droplet, or you can simply just DD Crow their Gimmick of a Nightmare when they choose to target it and give it to you, because if you let this card resolve, you're definitely not winning the game unless you're somehow playing Gimmick Puppet. Against the Branded deck, it's somewhat resilient to most of these hand traps. It has lines under both Dimension Shifter and Purulia fairly well, I think. The reason I put them as mid is because they still do sort of hurt the deck. Shifter makes it so they lose out a lot of their graveyard advantage, but it's not like they can't play at all. And similarly with Purulia, they do have the option to summon many times from hand with a card like Cartesia or the Bystials, but they don't necessarily have to in order to play. So that's why I think these two cards are pretty mid. Droll and Lockbird, I was even hesitant to put in mid because I truly don't think this card is that great against the Branded deck. They can do a lot of stuff in phases that are not main phase 1, so you can go draw phase, Branded opening. But I did put it as mid because there are quite a few search cards in the deck, so if they start with something like Albion to draw one, for example, or Allure of Darkness, it can be pretty solid in those cases. I wouldn't write this card off completely, but I think for the most part, Branded has pretty solid lines to either play around or play through these cards. Fulos, on the other hand, I think is a different story. This is a very good card against Branded, not only because they summon multiple times from the extra deck through cards like Albion and the regular fusion summoning, they also have cards like Fusion Deployment, which would just summon a card from deck and give you even more draws from there. So Fulos is definitely one of the cards I choose to play against this deck. Even if you draw it as your 6th card, it's not that bad either, because they do have quite a few options to fusion summon on your turn, so it's also a pretty solid card in that case. Next up is Ritual Beast, and against Ritual Beast, I would say the main card to stop is both the Canahawks. The Spiritual Beast Canahawk is pretty much their main starter. They have other ways to start their plays, of course, but Canahawk I'd say is the best one, and it allows them to do the most with just a single card. So I think that being able to hit this before they're able to get anything banished and get anything going is super important. But if they already started to get things going with Ulti Canahawk, I think that if you can somehow stop this card with either, let's say, like Dominus Impulse or Solemn Strike, for example, it's definitely worth it, because this card helps them keep grabbing more cards to help them keep playing and comboing. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the Nemesis engine. Most Ritual Beast decks are playing some sort of Nemesis engine, going into Infernal Flame Banshee as a generic rank 4 to search Nemesis Flag, and then they're either searching out Arch Nemesis Protoss, or they're searching out Nemesis Corridor to make a Thunder Dragon Colossus. So if you have, let's say, just a single hand trap and you're afraid of your opponent being able to play through that single hand trap, I think that saving it for the Infernal Flame Banshee is definitely not a bad idea. Against Ritual Beast, Dimension Shifter is bad. I mean, they play it themselves, and while it does disrupt their combo a tiny bit, they can definitely play well under it, and I definitely wouldn't side it against them. Droll and Lockbird, I think for the most part, it's supposed to be pretty good against them, but the reason I'm only putting it as mid is because they actually play quite a few ways to counter Droll and Lockbird that you wouldn't expect. So of course they can play cards like Crossout Designator and Call by the Grave, but if they also resolve a card like Shifter or Dimensional Fissure against you, cards which they'll be playing anyways, then Droll and Lockbird just becomes a dead card in your hand. So I would caution against using Droll and Lockbird against this deck. Yes, it's very strong when it resolves, but they have quite a few ways to make it so it doesn't resolve. And then both Molcharmies are very good against this deck. They normal summon many times in their combo, and they summon many times from the extra deck as well, so not much to really say about those. If you have access to the Molcharmies, I definitely choose to play them against Ritual Beast. The next deck I want to talk about is Rescue Ace. So Rescue Ace, their main card is going to be Rescue Ace Turbulence. Turbulence is the one that sets 4 from their deck, and most of their plays are going to center around sticking this card on the board and forcing its effect through one way or another. So if you're able to cut them off from searching this card, or if they summon it onto the field and you somehow can remove it or prevent its effect from going off, I think that's huge. They do have a few ways to get it out onto the board more than once per turn, so I think that it's important to know that even if you're able to stop one, they have the potential to summon out another one. So if you're saving a few interruptions for this, I think you should be good. Emergency is something I want to bring attention to next. It is a starter if they have another Rescue Ace monster, but I wanted to highlight it in particular because this is the card that allows Rescue Ace to play around cards like Infinite Impermanence, for example, because they can simply chain this and summon another Rescue Ace from their deck. And then finally, I want to talk about Hydrant. Once again, it is one of their starter cards, so you can choose to stop it if you want, but I want to highlight its importance in the Rescue Ace deck because the Rescue Ace spells and traps that they'll set off Turbulence. If your opponent controls a Rescue Ace Hydrant, and they have those spells and traps, they get bonus effects. So if you're somehow able to prevent them from getting access to Hydrant, or if you somehow remove the Hydrant from the board on your turn, I think that could be really good because it makes it so these cards are a lot more manageable to deal with. Against the Rescue Ace deck, I would say only Dimension Shifter is really good against them. If you use Dimension Shifter, they will still be able to put out Rescue Ace Turbulence on the board, but it'll make it so their plays are a lot worse and it'll cut them off of quite a bit of follow-up. So I think it's definitely a very solid card against them. Droll and Lockbird, not so much. They really only search once during their combo, I think, for the most part, unless they have a couple of weird hands, so I don't think it's that good against them. Plus, they have ways to get access to their monsters with cards like Emergency that don't require them to add cards from their deck to their hand. And then both the Moltres I think are pretty mid against them. I think Perulia is maybe okay. They do have quite a few cards that can summon from hand with cards like Preventer and Turbulence plus their normal summon, but I don't think you're getting too many draws off of this, and it isn't really gonna deter them from going on with their regular combo. They don't necessarily have to access their extra deck at all during the first turn. If you play this card, yeah, it can be okay because you can trade 1-for-1 with the Emergency and force them to not end on anything more than just set 4 pass, but I think that for the most part, Fulos and Moltres Perulia just probably aren't that great against this deck. They won't be the worst cards in the world in your deck, if you have to keep them in, they're okay, but I wouldn't choose to side these against Rescue Ace if I had the choice. Next up is Memento Fiendsmith, and I would say the main card of the Memento engine to hit is the Seahorse. This card allows them to dump essentially 3 of their key monsters to the graveyard to get additional effects and sort of snowball from there. So I think being able to cut them off of access to this is very important. I think it's going to be hard for them to fulfill the condition of destroying a monster on their own turn, plus it will prevent them from sending a key resources to the graveyard that will recur themselves and get them more advantage from there. The other card I want to talk about is Memento Fusion, and Memento Fusion I think is one of the best cards in this deck because not only does it get them access to a card like Creation King, which is very strong, allowing them to dump 3 cards to the graveyard, but it also gets them additional searchers as well once it hits the grave. So I think that the important thing against this card is just preventing your opponent from getting full value out of it. So either preventing your opponent from destroying one of their own cards, making it so the Memento Fusion has to fuse like a normal fusion spell, or just preventing them from getting access to it in the first place is also good because that means they lose out on 2 of the best monsters in their deck being their fusion boss monsters. And then finally, the Fiendsmith engine I think is also fine to hit in this deck. It's not as good as it was before. This is the deck's like fallback plan, and if you have multiple layers of interruption, being able to hit this makes it so your opponent just pretty much won't be able to do anything at all if you stop their main Memento push. Against this deck, all 4 of these linger effects are very good. Shifter is great against them. They rely very heavily on sending stuff to the graveyard. Droll and Lockbird is also really good against them. They can search a couple of times in their combo, and using Droll can severely limit their plays. Although I will mention about Droll, they not only have certain lines through it and around it, they also can sequence their plays in a way where they just push their 1 required search for the Memento Fusion through, and even if you Droll them afterwards, it's not that big of a deal. So that's something I would caution you about if you do choose to play Droll in your deck. And then both Moltres are very solid against them. They have quite a few cards that will summon from hand, like Tatsuno Shigo, cards like Sleepy, plus their normal summon, so this card's very good against them. Fulos is also very strong against them. Their quick play spell, Bone Party, summons from the deck, plus they summon quite a few times from the extra deck because they do play generic cards like the Fiendsmith stuff, but also they need to go through their main fusion monsters in order to get off their full combo. So all these cards are very good against them, and I think that you're going to be more likely to be able to stop a Memento player by playing these cards as opposed to those one-off hand traps like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence. The next deck I want to talk about are Whitewoods variants. I think against the Whitewoods deck, the main card you want to hit is LZ. This is the card that allows them to essentially get access to their synchros and start synchro climbing from there. It is a cost for it to send from hand to the graveyard, so if you have something like Ash Blossom, it can be very strong. Forcing this to stay in hand and not giving them access to the Whitewood tuners in their deck is also very good. If they do get to the point in the combo where they start synchroing, I think the best card to stop against them is probably the Diebell. Diebell is probably one of the more broken cards in their deck, allowing them to add back a spell or trap they sent. So if they sent like a Floodgate, for example, or a Runick spell, they can just simply grab it back from the graveyard and use it again. Plus, this card allows them to summon out a tuner synchro monster on your turn, being a Zapper Shrimp, which will destroy a spell or trap, and then they can quick synchro into any synchro 10. This card does a lot for the deck, so I think that being able to stop this card if they get access to it is also very important. And then the last thing I want to bring attention to is, I guess, the Whitewoods supplementary engine. So whether they're playing the Azamina cards with cards like Deception, or they're playing a toy version with Toy Box, I think that being able to cut them off of these cards are very good, because it cuts them off of the flow of spells and traps to send with the Whitewoods, but it also makes it so the deck is a lot more manageable and a lot more fair, because if they only have access to the Whitewoods cards, they aren't that crazy by themselves. I think the crazy part about these decks are, once they get going with their supplementary engines, they stoneball advantage really quickly. So if you're able to cut them off of these supplementary engines at the start, it can be really strong and make it so this deck isn't that powerful anymore. Against the Whitewoods variants, I would say, once again, all these lingering effects are pretty good. Shifter is very strong because they won't get value from sending their spells and traps to the graveyard. Droll is very good. They search quite a few times, and most of the time their supplementary engines are also going to search quite a bit. Purulia is fine, I think, as well. They will summon LZ from hand. They will normal summon, and if they play Diebelster, that's something else as well. And then Fulos is really good because they are like a synchro climbing deck. So they'll start with a synchro 6, they'll climb into a synchro 8, and then they might have runic cards on top of that as well, or like the Azamina cards. So you should be getting quite a few draws if they choose to go full combo, or if you just stop them in their tracks with a card like Fulos, their end board just isn't going to be that scary. The next deck I want to talk about is Chimera Fiendsmith. Against Chimera Fiendsmith, the main cards I would hit are Mirror Sword Knight and Gazelle. Mirror Sword Knight is essentially just Gazelle because this is the card they're summoning most of the time off of it. Because hitting Gazelle is strong because it cuts them off of Chimera Fusion. And if you ever played a Fusion deck, you know if you don't have a Fusion spell, your deck becomes infinitely worse. So I think that being able to stop them from getting access to their Fusion spell is very important, because then they'll have a bunch of dead monsters in hand that really don't do much unless they're fused. That being said, Chimera Fusion is also something important for you to cut off. If you're not able to stop them from getting it to hand, I think that stopping them from resolving it with a card like Dominus Impulse is very good, because they won't be able to add it back from grave to hand unless they specifically have the Chimera in their graveyard or field somewhere. And if they don't resolve it the first time, they're not going to be able to have access to that. And preventing them from getting it back to their hand with a card like DD Crow can also be good, because then they don't have a way to summon a card like Guardian Chimera on your turn. And then lastly, I want to talk about the Fiendsmith engine in this deck. I think in this deck in particular, it's a little better because Fiendsmith Sequence can summon any Fiend Fusion monster, so they can summon their Chimera monsters from their extra deck, and I think that's pretty good. So if you have extra hand traps or interruptions, stopping the sequence can be really important to prevent them from getting access to their Chimera Fusions and starting the flow of resources in the first place. Against this deck in general, I would say all these hand traps are very good except for Purulia. Shifter is great because they require their cards in the graveyard to trigger, plus the Fiendsmith cards require the graveyard to work. Drone Lockboard is very good because they search many times in their combo with their main engine pieces like Corfield Kodo, Gazelle, plus Nightmare Apprentice, things like that. Purulia, I'd say, is pretty mid because as off the top of my head, they're really only going to be summoning twice max. So I think that most of the time you're just trading 1 for 1. And against this deck in particular, they also have ways to bring monsters back from the graveyard and stuff. So even if they have those monsters, they can simply fuse them off and then bring them back from the graveyard to sort of get around Purulia. Fulos, on the other hand, is very good against this deck. They're not going to be able to push many of their plays through under this card, and if they do try to go full combo, they're going to give you quite a few cards, making it so you're able to deal with their end board a lot easier. Most of the time, if you Fulos them, they'll just have access to maybe like one hand rip with their Chimera Fusion monster, and then they'll have a set Chimera Fusion to fuse into Guardian Chimera on your turn, which can be okay, but it did stop them from getting access to their main combo, which is the main thing you want with a card like Fulos. The next deck is Mermail Atlantean. The main card you want to hit is Neptibus. I will mention with Neptibus, since he does send for cost, it is kind of hard to interact with this card because unless you remove it from the board right away on summon, they're going to get advantage in one form or another. But if you know your opponent is trying to get access to Neptibus, you can cut them off of cards that get them there, like Atlantean Dragoons, for example, prevent it from ever hitting the field in the first place, making it a lot harder for them to start their plays and extend their plays through your interruptions. The next card is Abyss Rhyme. This is one of their key extenders in this deck because it lets them summon a card like Super Ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth from their main deck. So if you hand trap them a couple of times, you can sort of expect them to try to search for this card and send off any Mermail or Atlantean to summon this from their deck and just flood the field and keep comboing. So being able to hit this with a card like I think Dominus Impulse or Ash Blossom is very strong, and keeping in mind also that this card can act as an interruption on your turn as well, allowing them to discard a card like Heavy Infantry to draw one and then pop one off of the infantry. So do keep in mind that this is a pretty key card in this deck and a very good extender. You should always expect them to try to search this when they're trying to play through interruptions. And then finally, I want to talk about Dragoons and Mermail Shadow Squad in particular. These are the best water discards in the deck, and this is what allows them to keep comboing essentially, because these will give them continual advantage every time they're sent by a water monster's effect, Dragoons in particular. So I think that if you're able to prevent them from getting access to these cards, making it so the waters they discard don't do anything, it'll make it a lot harder for them to keep pushing through because they won't be gaining advantage as they're summoning out their monsters. I guess Mermail, all these cards are very good. There isn't really much to say about them. They need their graveyard for all their effects to resolve, essentially. They search many times in their combo. They summon a few times from hand, not just with their normal summon, but their engine pieces like Mermail Megalo and Mermail Abysteus, so you'll get quite a few draws off Perulia if they choose to do that. And of course, they spam out Xyz monsters from the extra deck, so hitting them with Fulos is also very strong. Next up is Voiceless Voice. Against Voiceless Voice, their main card is going to be Low. Being able to cut them off of access from Low makes it so their end board is a lot less scary, not only because they don't have access to their barrier, it also makes it so their main ritual monster isn't an Omni-Negate anymore, so they just essentially don't do anything if they don't have access to Low. That being said, hitting barrier is also very good because it's continual follow-up every single turn, but it also protects their board as well from targeting, so I think that removing this card with a card like Cosmic is also very strong and something you should prioritize when playing against the deck. Diviner of the Herald is how they get to Low. They'll dump a card with like Trias Hierarchia, and then use the effect to tribute Diviner, and then summon out the Trias. Diviner will summon Low from the deck. So I think if you're able to stop the Diviner with a card like Imperm, if you hit the Trias out of the graveyard, it's also very strong and prevents them from getting access to Low in the first place. One other engine card that's very good in this deck is the Saphira. Not only does it get them access to the ritual monster that they need for their combos, but hitting Saphira is also good because if you're able to somehow get it out of the graveyard with a card like Call by the Grave or Bestial, it's also very good because they're not going to have a ritual spell that often, and they do rely on using Saphira as a way to ritual summon. It'll make them go out of their way to actually grab the ritual spell and ritual summon it properly. For the lingering effects against Voiceless Voice, Shifter is okay, I think. They do play a pretty simplistic strategy, so they could technically still set up their full end board under Shifter, but it is pretty good against them for cutting off their follow-up and preventing some plays like Heralds from going through. So I probably actually put this as a check mark, but I did want to bring to your attention that they do technically have a way to just play as if it isn't there. They'll just lose out on a lot of their follow-up. Droll is very good against this deck like it is against all their ritual decks. They search many times through their engine and require getting many pieces to their hand in order to perform their ritual combo, so hitting them with Droll is very good. Both the Charmies are pretty mid against this deck. At most, you'll get like one draw off of Perulia off their normal summon, and then maybe one draw off of their ritual summon. Fulos, I think, is pretty bad. I don't think they ever end on an extra deck monster, and they definitely don't have to summon from the main deck at all, aside from their Diviner. So you're not really going to get any value off of both the Molcharmies, in my opinion, so I just wouldn't choose to play them against this deck. And then next up is Labrynth. Against the Labrynth deck, their welcome Labrynth traps are their key ways to summon their monsters and get them access to engine, and hitting them before they get access to their big monsters is very important because those big monsters will essentially keep allowing them to snowball advantage from there. And then speaking of the big monsters, I wanted to highlight Lady Labrynth of the Silver Castle in particular because her effect is one that you actually have a decent way of playing around, because every time a trap card is activated, you can simply just activate any other card that I guess isn't a normal trap card, and it makes it so she actually can't set one from the deck. So that's something important to keep in mind. And then finally, the other Labrynth monsters like the furniture monsters like Hooklock and then Butler, hitting these I think can be really good as well against the deck, because these are cards that keep recycling themselves, and essentially will keep getting them more advantage every time they use, and they'll slowly start to spiral out of control. So I think that if you're able to stop them early from getting any value, they won't be able to really get their engine rolling, and it'll be difficult for them to get a flow of resources. So being able to cut this off, I think, is pretty important. And then against Labrynth, pretty simply, none of these cards are going to do anything against them. They don't really do much aside from flip trap cards and maybe normal summon. So I don't think that it's worth siding any of these cards in against them. And I guess that's one of the appeals of the deck. It doesn't lose to any of these cards. And then finally, the last deck I want to talk about is Runick Stun. Even though there isn't really anything crazy about this deck that most people won't know, I think it's important to highlight that if you're able to cut them off a fountain, it's going to be a lot easier to beat them. So hitting a card like Runick Tip with the Ash Blossom may seem like a 1-for-1, but against Runick Stun in particular can be very good, because if they don't have access to the fountain, you should be able to quickly overpower them. I put Hugin in the corner as well, because if you are able to stop a card like Runick Tip and you force them to go into a card like Hugin in order to search it, there are so many more ways for you to stop it with a card like Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler, for example. That'll make it so essentially they won't ever get access to fountain, and will have to hope they drew enough floodgates to hold you off until they hard draw into it. And then the last card I wanted to highlight were, like, I guess the consistency cards in the deck, like Pot of Duality and Card of Demise. These can be pretty solid if you're scared of seeing a specific floodgate. So for example, if you're playing Tenpai and you don't want to see your opponent add Grave of the Super Ancient Organism, you can use your interruptions to stop cards like Duality or Demise to prevent them from seeing them in the first place, if you think you can just simply deal with the Runick engine otherwise. And then very simply against this deck, none of these hand traps are going to do anything. Similar idea against the Labrynth deck. They don't really do anything, so there's no reason to be putting in any of these hand traps against this deck. If you had to keep one in because you had no way to side any of them out, I would keep in Droll and Lockbird, because maybe there's a chance they have a few draw cards in their hand. But outside of that, I would definitely not choose to play any of these in my deck against Runick. So that's going to do it for this video. I know it's a bit of a longer one, but let me know what you think about this type of guide. And if you guys enjoyed it, I'll make one for every single format. It is a little different from your standard how to hand trap video, but I did want to cover the key cards against each deck as opposed to specific places to hand trap, because I think that knowing what the key cards are in every matchup and how they help each deck advance their plays can be good, not only if you have hand traps, but also if you just have regular disruptions. You'll know which cards to hit and why they're so good. So if you guys enjoyed this style of, I guess, hand trap guide or how to counter guide, let me know in the comment section below. If you think there's anything I could change, I'm also open to feedback and I would love to hear it. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.